here I wish to allude to a very non-standard solution of the hard problem of consciousness, which was called Perennial Idealism by Miri al-Bahari. This is, I think, a typically Indian way of solving the hard problem of consciousness. Indeed, what we called in our chapter about phenomenology, turning the problem of consciousness upside down, was mostly taken for granted in the Indian civilization. In the Indian civilization, it's absolutely obvious that consciousness is primary, and all the rest, namely objects and so on, might well be a projection of this consciousness. Well, this is not something that every Indian believes, of course, but it's a basic view that circulates in all the people and in all the culture. There was a day in which I was discussing with young Indian students in physics, cognitive science, and so on, and we asked each other some metaphysical questions. And these young students told me, oh, it's obvious everything comes from consciousness. And they smiled and they stared at me as if they were asking, don't you think it's obvious? And I said, you know, in the West, this is an extremely non-standard view, and we usually believe that everything comes from matter. So this day I realized how different cultures are, and in this case it's very striking. So instead, what we consider as the normal, naturalistic way of putting the problem of consciousness, namely in physicalist or materialist terms, was a curiosity, a maverick position in traditional India. And still now, it remains a position that is held only by a few specialists of neuroscience and cognitive neuroscience. So it is very striking to see that there are at least 30, 40, maybe 50 words for consciousness in Sanskrit. Maybe 40 words that we tend to translate by the word, our unique word, consciousness. According to Roberto Calasso, this is easily explained because Indian civilization is that exceptional moment of the human adventure whose unique project was to generate a certain state of consciousness, the yogic state of consciousness, and to organize around it the gestures and words of a non-historical social life. Namely, you know, it's very well known that it's very difficult to find a history of India. It's very difficult to find the equivalent of Thucydide in Greece, or Sallust in Rome, and so on, a history of the culture and civilization of India. This is because what was looked for was not something historical, but something unhistorical, a state, the most basic state of consciousness you can think of. So here are some words for consciousness in Sanskrit. There is one that is closely connected to the English word consciousness, namely to the Latin conscientia, which means gathering knowledge or knowing with others. Cum scientia. Scientia means knowledge, cum means with, together. In Sanskrit, almost the same words, because it's an Indo-European language, so very similar to Latin. Samjna, consciousness. Sam means like the cum of the Latin language, and jna like the gnosis of Greek. And samvid also. Sam like the Latin cum, and vid like the Latin video, which means vision, which means seeing. Another word is a little bit more strange for us. It's pratyaya, which means going towards, which sound a little bit like the Husserlian intentionality. Consciousness is what is directed towards its own objects. Also, there is a word, of course, in English you have a word for conscious, namely the moral sense, and in Sanskrit, this is the word that corresponds to this use is antakarana, which means the inner doing, the moment in which you turn towards yourself in order to examine yourself. You do something on yourself. In English, we have also a word for awareness, which comes from the where, the Saxon where, beware, pay attention, beware of warriors, for instance. This is a typical use in Saxon. In Sanskrit, you have a flurry of words. Chetana, Chaitanya, which means perceive, pay attention, observe. But also you have manaskara, which means the mental doing, maybe the reflectivity. Or vimarsha, which means touching, sensing. Or also indriya jnana, namely the sensory knowledge. And so on. You have plenty of words which can translate awareness. Also, you have self-consciousness. Self-consciousness, it's really much more about reflectivity and even a sort of egoistic self-reflectivity. This was expressed by Sanskrit by words such as ahamta, which means me-ness, or ahamkara, which means the fabric of myself, the moment in which I fabricate my ego in order to get some advantages or to get some stability in my life and so on. Also, well, there are things that usually you don't say in English. For instance, the inner light. You usually skip this aspect of consciousness. But in Sanskrit, you have plenty of words that convey this meaning, such as samvid prakasha, the light of consciousness. Samvid is consciousness, prakasha is the light. And also, finally, discriminating consciousness. Usually here again, you don't say that in English. But in Sanskrit, you have a word for that, a specific word. It's vijnana. Jnana means knowledge, and vi means separation. So vijnana means knowing a part, and it's often translated by consciousness. Okay. Now, in view of this civilization of consciousness, you can wonder what is the solution to the hard problem of consciousness in such a civilization. It can be something that was shared not only in India, but in many other civilizations, at least in the circles of mysticism. And we will see some mystical authors of the West also, not only the practitioners of yoga in India. So, Perennial Idealism, a mystical solution to the mind-body problem, was the title of a paper by Miriam Bahari, and she points out that, in fact, in many other civilizations than our present Western civilizations, the mind-body problem didn't arise at all, because there was no such thing as a body separate from the mind. So, to seek fundamental truth, she says, analytic metaphysicians mean, modern English-speaking metaphysicians or philosophers. They start with observed phenomena. and they try to derive all the rest from observed phenomena. Then they move outwards using discursive thought to posit scientifically informed theories about the ultimate reality behind appearances. We usually think that appearances are just appearances and that behind appearances is hidden a true reality. And we usually think also that this true reality is a mathematical reality, a reality that can be described in mathematical terms. So we believe, for instance, that all this appearance is just an appearance, and behind it there is the laws of quantum chromodynamics that takes into account the behavior of quarks and other elementary particles described by exquisitely complex mathematical equations. Now, mystics also seek to uncover the reality behind appearances, but not behind, namely, behind what we see, rather upstream, within. That's the difference. So they try to uncover what is upstream, the appearances, what is within us, and that explains why we see such appearances. However, their meditative methods typically start with experience and go inwards to a fundamental reality sometimes described as a pure conscious unity. So what they discover by going inwards, by going upstream this level of pure object-like appearances, is the unity of consciousness. And they say that is what there is. What there is one consciousness. And all the rest is a production of this consciousness. This is the so-called mystical solution to the mind-body problem. This is perennial idealism. With consciousness intrinsic to the fundament, the hard problem that faces materialists would not even arise. Neither would the causal interface problems that beset dualists. So neither dualism nor materialism, but rather perennial idealism is sufficient to dissolve the mind-body problem, the hard problem of consciousness, and so on and so on. But, well, of course, there is a problem left, another problem, a very different problem. If you accept that all there is this one consciousness, then how is it possible that things appear as multiple? How is it that we see so many objects, so many various objects, and that we distinguish each other? My person is distinct from another person, and so on and so on. How is it possible that this multiplicity arises from this unity? Okay, here you have, first of all, you have a difference between two types of knowledge. The first type of knowledge, which is our usual knowledge, the one that we have learned at school and that science is performing, is a frontal relationship between me and the world, and I would say a dualizing between me and the world. But the other way of knowing is the one of mystics, of yoga, of meditation. It's a way of knowing that affirms the primacy of belonging over relationship. You know something in this case, not if you have posited it as an object, but if you are this something and you coincide with this something, and then you can know this something. What is the difference between these two stances and these two types of knowledge? The mystical and the scientific. Most metaphysical systems, whatsoever, either mystical or, I would say, materialistic, will appear to brute fact. Every metaphysical system says, I'm based on the facts. A brute fact is a fact that is not itself being further reduced or explained. But what are the brute facts? The crucial question is where the brute facts are being placed. That's the point. Are the brute facts the fact that there are objects out there? Or are the brute facts the fact that we experience the objects out there? Materialism, dualism, panpsychism, these are three ways of dealing with the mind-body problem or the problem of consciousness. Materialism being a complete elimination of the problem by elimination of experience itself, dualism by claiming that there is a second entity that exists besides matter, and panpsychism, the idea that in fact everything has a psychical property that is attached to it, every object, every item of the world. Miri Albahari here notices that this sequence of three doctrines heads in a direction that places consciousness closer and closer to the ground of all being. The more you go from the left to the right of this list, the more you come close to consciousness as the ground of all being. At the end of the process, even beyond panpsychism, more extreme by panpsychism, you get the so-called perennial idealism, which is, we have said that it is the mystical solution to the mind-body problem. And here, in order to see what is this perennial idealism, we just have to read some texts. For instance, the text of the Mandukya Upanishad, who says, beyond the senses, beyond the understanding, beyond all expression, is the pure unitary consciousness, wherein awareness of the world and of multiplicity is completely obliterated. There is no more multiplicity, there is pure oneness of one experience. It is ineffable peace. It is the supreme good. It is one without a second. It is the self, where self here translates Atman, which is not the personal self, which is the universal self, of course. Then, in the West, you can find very similar remarks. For instance, I can find one in Meister Eckhart or in Plotinus, and well, there are plenty of such remarks. For instance, this one by Meister Eckhart says, the eye with which I see God is the same as that with which he sees me. So there is coincidence of the individual self and the universal self, and both are one. Or also Plotinus, almost the same remark. Its being, the being of what he called the good, which could be called the good or Atman or whatsoever, its being is its gaze on itself. Namely, for that entity, being means having a gaze on itself, namely, essentially, being aware of what it is to be. So, as I told you, the challenge of this position is to understand how the world, as it appears to us, with its tables, trees, atoms, and people, multiplicity of things, could conceivably be construed as a manifestation from the ground of our perspectival and unconditioned consciousness. How is it that this multiplicity comes from the one? This is the new problem. The other one was a hard problem. This one is quite hard also. But let's think a little bit more about it. In fact, this problem has been addressed long ago by philosophers, including Western philosophers such as Kant, Husserl, and Carnap, for instance. It's called the problem of constitution of objectivity. How do we come to believe that there are things that are independent of us, that are external to us, out of our lived experience? And Husserl did a lot of work on this problem. Kant did a lot of work of this problem. Husserl said, it is in various forms of intentionality of consciousness that objects constitute themselves as what they are. Namely, each object is not something that exists out there. It is the theme of an intentional act. It is the theme of an intentional act that has its own structure of expectation about something that should come from the object if further explored. Also, there was the famous Carnap's logical construction of the world, in German Aufbau der Welt. The idea of Carnap is that you can reconstruct the world out of what he called an auto-psychological basis made of elementary experiences, namely out of the immediately given. The immediately given is what is experienced. So out of that, if you do enough work in order to find the structure of what is immediately given, you should be able to reconstruct what you call an external world. And how do you do that? According to Carnap, again, is that, he noticed that even though the individual streams of experience are different from one another, some structural properties are analogous for all streams of experience. If science is to be objective, it must restrict itself to statements about such structural properties. Namely, what is the structure that is common to all the experiences of all the individuals is deemed to be something that is objective. You can also say that what is structurally common to all experiences is what defines objectivity. And it's how we construct an objective world by extracting common structures, structures that are common from one moment to another of my own experience and from one experience of someone to another experience of another person. And finally, you can say, okay, but this was noticed long ago by Buddhist authors, such as in this text of the Lankavatara Sutra, which bases the Zen Buddhism, essentially. And the Lankavatara Sutra says this. It says, because the various projections of people's minds appear before them as objects, they become attached to the existence of their projections. Okay? So various projections of people's minds appear before them as objects. Why do they appear before them as objects? Because they know that they have some structural features that are independent on the change of subject. But if we come to believe that these projections of minds are objects existing out there, how do we get free of such attachment to objects? And the Lankavatara Sutra replies, by becoming aware that projections are nothing but mind. So once you have performed the constitution of objectivity, in order to be freed from the belief in the independent existence of these objects, you just have to realize how you did in the first place to build their notion. And when you are aware of that, then you are freed.